Good morning. Good morning, and welcome to everybody as you are joining us this Thursday morning for our ForeCASt webinar. Thanks so much. Literally just going to give it 30 seconds or so for people to filter in and get comfortable, and then we'll make sure that we get started. So, good morning and welcome to episode 5 of ForeCASt. Thanks so much for choosing to spend the next hour with us this morning as we're talking all things homes and housing. Grab a cup of tea, a coffee, make yourself comfortable, and hopefully we've got a great hour ahead of us. Today actually marks our 1 year anniversary of our ForeCASt webinars. Hard to believe it's been a year since we've sort of been on this journey. We've had over 1,000 sign-ups. We've had 4 incredible webinars before us covering a range of different topics, and we've had some brilliant conversations along the way, and hopefully today will be more of the same. Today's episode is called There's No Place Like Home. A pretty familiar refrain that we know Dorothy says during The Wizard of Oz as she longs for the safety and security of home. Yet sadly, for thousands and thousands of people across Scotland, home is not the place that it should be. It's been more than a year since the Scottish Government declared a housing emergency, and I'm sure we can all agree that urgent action is needed. We've a really great lineup of speakers for us this morning. You're going to get the chance to hear from colleagues from Citizens Advice Scotland. You'll get to hear from one of our local cabs, and you'll get to hear from leading housing charity Shelter. As ever, there's going to be loads of time for questions and discussions as we move about the morning. So hopefully you can already see the question and answer function on your screens. Don't hold back, get your questions in as people are speaking, and we will do our very best to try to make sure we get through just as many as we can. So let's get started. I'm going to hand us over now to David Hilferty, the Director of Impact at CAS, who's going to talk us through some of the key issues and trends that we've been seeing across the network of cabs here in Scotland, and in particular what demand for housing advice looks like. So David, over to you.
Thanks so much, Emma, and morning, everyone. Great to see so many people joining the call. So I'm speaking today from Portland House, which is our office in Glasgow city centre. It's home to our extra help unit, absolutely brilliant team of colleagues and a genuine centre of excellence in terms of the support for people in the most complex, the most vulnerable and often desperate circumstances. But befitting of the theme today, it's also the temporary home of one of our Glasgow cabs, and some of the team have been set up here in recent weeks after the roof came in on them, and that's not a metaphor for demand, by the way, albeit it be a pretty appropriate one. Now, I've often said that when you walk into a cab, there's a real magic to it, and it's the same here among our team of brilliant extra help unit colleagues, and it's a privilege to sit alongside these colleagues every day. And indeed, much of what I'll say today is framed as much by these types of conversations as it is by our immense evidence base, because I think it's natural, and we do it all the time, that we tend to hone in on what's not working, what needs to change. But even in spite of all of that, time spent in a cab, time spent in EHU, always an uplifting experience. You know, that mixture of intense urgency, but also a really calm assurance, that unmistakable sense that after months, sometimes years of trying to address something, at last someone's got your back, and there's not many feelings like that, is there? Local advice, underpinned by local knowledge, how local people want it. And I say that now because that close proximity, if we can flick to the next slide, please, as a reminder, if anyone needed at all, that while discussion around data can often feel quite academic, quite abstract, a wee bit distant or detached, what you'll hear today couldn't be further away from that. Because the difference with our data, the difference with our insight lies in its authenticity. It's what sets us apart. It's a massive part of why we launched this webinar series, as Emma said a year ago to the day. It's entrenched in the experiences of real people, and it only exists because of the essential advice and support provided by the network. One does not, one cannot exist without the other. Can we flip to the next slide, please? And the next one. Let's take a look at overall numbers across the last quarter. During the first quarter of the year, Bureau supported 55,000 people with close to 310,000 pieces of advice, and it's always worth taking a pause on that. You know, the overall number of people speaks to the incredible reach and footprint in communities all across Scotland. Huge, increasing volume of demand, but the pieces of advice speaks to the depth and often is a reflection of the complexity, because just as our advice is immense in scale and quantity, it's equally so in terms of its depth. And what is it then that people are seeking advice on? So the next slide sets out some more detail here on our most in-demand advice areas across the last quarter. Again, I'd invite you to look at the nature of the themes here. Everything here is absolutely fundamental, isn't it? These are the things that all of us need to live a decent life, to lead a dignified life. And these are issues that people don't seek advice on just because you're feeling a wee bit curious, are they? This is urgent, this is essential, this is about survival, social security, debt and money, energy, homes, the theme for today. Of course, these are the building blocks that collectively constitute what someone's standard of living looks like. And I think there's a tendency for us to say that people can get advice on anything that's for everyone. In reality, they don't. It's where people need it most, and it's on the things that matter most, and the things that we all need. And so, in that respect, our evidence base highlights where people are experiencing most harm. I caught a bit of Newsnight last week. For context, I've got a 3-year-old, I've got a 13-month-old. So, if I'm lucky and on a good night, a very good night, there's about a 15-minute window at the end of the evening. So that's what I was doing. I was catching the end of Newsnight. But anyway, I was thrown back by one question from the interviewer, and he said, "Are we seeing a new cost of living crisis?" And where to start with that one, eh? Because, of course, as colleagues, as cab colleagues, as colleagues across the sector will attest, the cost of living crisis isn't nearly over. It didn't end, and it also wasn't very new for lots of people. The very term betrays divergence of experience across different demographics. But what the cost of living crisis did and what it's doing is entrench existing inequality. And all of that is a reminder about how we get stuck in these moments, you know, whether it's news cycles, policymakers, governments. Last week it was food inflation. Yesterday it's the energy cap. We were on Radio Scotland, on BBC and so on. Energy cap, by the way, a misnomer. If ever there was one, when a cap isn't actually a cap and when it moves every 3 months anyway, completely inadequate protection. And as I've said before, and as we'll say again, that for us amounts to toleration of harm. Now, earlier this week, we published our latest energy brief. Yep, next slide, thanks. It's a concise and compelling account of people's actual experience of energy. Proportion of people in the network advised on energy showed the biggest change compared to the same quarter last year, up 25%. That's even in the warmest months of the year. Indeed, in the last 5 years, the number of people seeking our advice on energy debt jumped 65%. Moreover, on top of that, the overall quantum of debt people face is up 130%. So, what's that mean? It means more people need our support, but it also means that the circumstances in which people present, it's deeper harm, it's entrenched harm. And this time last year, we're probably in webinars like this one, across various meetings, hundreds of working groups, interviews like yesterday, and we're saying we surely can't go through another winter without a debt write-off scheme. We can't go through another winter without a social tariff, another moment. And guess what? Looks like we're about to do just that. Another winter without a debt write-off scheme, another winter without an affordable social tariff for energy. Again, for me, that amounts to toleration of harm, that policymakers, that government, that regulators know what's coming down the line, yet again, we're not ready for it, and what that means for people this winter. So, again, whether it's media, whether it's politicians, whether it's decision makers, it can feel like moving from moment to moment, from inflation cap to price cap, from quarter to quarter, from month to month. But for people with most at stake, for people at the sharp end, for the people coming to our cabs for advice, it's not about moving from moment to moment. It's more like getting stuck in moments and getting trapped in moments. And it becomes impossible to get out of it. They don't move on to the next one untarnished, unharmed. I think this next slide's an exemplification of that, because when that happens time and time again, this is what happens. This next visual as an exemplification of the failure of systems. So across the last 5 years, we supported 625,000 unique individuals. Again, let's pause on that. Massive numbers, such a striking number. I think the tendency here and the temptation might be to categorise this as repeat inquiries or repeat clients, but I'd invite you to flip that because, of course, there's a better way to articulate that, isn't there? Because it's the repeat failings of the system that repeatedly force people into crisis, and advisors are at the forefront of that. As I've said before, a backstop for failure in every other part of the system. And if the Citizen Advice Network was the NHS, would be accident and emergency, that trauma, that crisis, that urgency. Because after more than a decade of austerity, of perma-crisis, we're so often the last door open for people who are out of options, facing really unthinkable harm, unthinkable trauma, no let up, no respite, no straightforward open and shut cases. I hear that every day speaking to our caseworkers. I hear that every day speaking to advisors who've been in office over recent months. And if our evidence and insight shows where the harm is, if it pinpoints where we can observe systemic failure, that's especially true of housing because something is seriously wrong in housing. As Emma trailed in her own intro, it's a year or just over a year since Scottish Government declared a housing emergency. And we'll soon hear from Benjamin too. It's nearly 2 years since Edinburgh declared a housing emergency, one of the outriders, if you like, in the housing emergency stakes. And to that point about getting caught up in moments, these are two further examples of that. Beyond these declarations, beyond these moments, what does a housing emergency mean for people? What does it mean for the advisors who support them? Let's again look to our evidence. So on the next slide, while those recorded as living in rented or owner-occupier properties has remained broadly consistent over the last few years, the number of people recorded as being homeless or living in temporary accommodation has increased by 65% since the pandemic. In the last 2 years alone, to show that the pandemic itself isn't just a moment, the same number increased by 31%. These surges in demand are striking. The nature of advice demand is too. Again, this isn't people seeking advice just because you're a wee bit curious. It's out of fundamental, essential need. And as you'll soon hear from my colleague Aoife, behind these huge hikes are thousands of people trapped in these moments. Something intensely local about housing advice, why it's so good to hear from Benjamin later on as well, and how local support is so integral here. So recently we've been undertaking an analysis of people who come back to the network time and time again. And my colleague Linda drew my attention to the experience that's on your screen now. Now look at Andy's housing advice journey here. It goes back to at least October 2018. Back then, he's getting advice on harassment on illegal eviction in relation to a private sector rented property. 6 months on, we see the first mention of repairs. And this becomes a recurrent theme, doesn't it, across his advice journey between March 2019 and March 2024, advised in relation to repairs a further 13 times. Look at June 2025, he's seeking advice again. What's he seeking advice for? It's threatened homelessness. So what we've got here, we get a story of repeated systemic failure culminating in outright crisis. Now, Andy's not his real name. He's absolutely a real person, though. And again, these are real, these are entrenched systemic problems. But these are also real outcomes in terms of the difference that advice makes them, and it's so significant. Universal credit backdated payment, nearly £7,000. Annual gain of adult disability payment, more than £4,000 per year. Home heating fund, again, of £1,400. This slide could have gone on and on and on. So much life-changing outcomes from the support that he got from his local cab. Now, take a moment of your own here to imagine what would happen if the Citizen Advice Network wasn't there for him. We can't lose sight of that. We can't lose sight of the difference we make. So, again, to close my own comments this morning, we're here to tell the story of the issues. We're here to tell the story of the network and the difference it makes. But we're also here to tell the story that a different way and a different system is not just possible, but it's essential.
Thanks so much, David. I just think a really powerful reminder there to make sure that we are not getting stuck, like you say, in these moments that the media are trying to draw our attention to, but rather we take the opportunity to pull the lens up, look at the bigger picture, look at where the system is failing, and I guess ultimately start to think about the solutions that we need to see there. Please do pop your questions in the chat if there's anything that you want to ask, anything that's sparked a thought or reflection from what David shared. I'm delighted to introduce next this morning my colleague Aoife, who's our Senior Policy Officer specialising in housing policy within the social justice team. And Aoife's going to give us the opportunity to really take a bit of a deep dive into just some of the issues that people are coming to their local cabs for advice on. Over to you, Aoife.
Thanks, Emma. Really great to see so many people here today. Thanks so much for joining us. So as David has said, we see such a variety of advice needs across the network. And one of the most common housing issues that we see is repairs and maintenance, and more commonly damp and mould. I'm going to talk about this and also affordability as two of the big issues that people are coming to us with. So earlier this year, we published Left in the Cold, which is a report that looked at damp and mould cases from across our network over an 18-month period. Some of the stories and impacts that we came across while researching for this report were just nothing short of harrowing. From deteriorating health and homelessness, damage to possessions and furniture, and being unable to use entire rooms of their house, the impact of damp and mould just cannot be underestimated. In Q1 of this year as well, we started collecting quantitative evidence on damp and mould, so taking it out from repairs and maintenance, which it was previously recorded as. So we're now able to see exactly how much advice that we've been giving out on it. We found that between just April and June this year, a period of just 3 months, there were 300 damp and mould cases reported to us by advisors across the network. And this is also likely to be an underestimation and doesn't take in people who used our online advice pages either. So just to stop and pause on that's 300 times in just 3 months that Bureau gave advice to people because damp and mould was affecting their homes and their lives. That's 300 times that people felt enough was enough. Above all, however, we're concerned that not enough is being done to tackle damp and mould, knowing the impact it has on people. So I want to just share with you some more of the detail of people's experiences that we uncovered as we were researching for the Left in the Cold report. All of the names have, of course, been changed for privacy. Some people, like Laura, experienced extreme food poverty as a result of damp and mould. When Laura and her husband sought advice from their local bureau, they were experiencing homelessness and were living in a temporary flat. The flat itself was damp and cold, with mould all over the walls. Their bed was even wet to touch. Laura told us that they were spending about £12 a day just to try and heat the flat, and that's a huge chunk of their low income. At the time, Laura was also pregnant, and her midwife was horrified at the conditions the couple were living in, so tried to write to the council about the standard of the accommodation. Next slide, please. Some people, like Mary, experienced a direct impact on their health. At the time Mary came to us for advice, the damp in her home had caused her to develop a lung condition, and it also impacted the health of her daughter. When she asked about repairs being done, her social landlord said that there was just no funds to carry out the required work. Some people, like Martin, had to even live apart from their family. In order to help with poor energy efficiency and damp and mould, Martin had to have his old boiler replaced, which sounds like a quick and easy fix. However, Martin's housing association said he would have to wait 6 months for this repair to be done. And in the meantime, he had no option but to use expensive electric heaters, which just didn't heat his home properly. His partner had recently had a transplant operation and couldn't deal with the unbearable cold, so herself and her young daughter had to move out of the home during this period. And lastly, people like Nick, who became homeless. When Nick approached us for advice, his council home was so damp that it had worsened his COPD. He'd been advised by the council to give up the property and they would find him somewhere else to live. However, after a few days in hotel accommodation, the council informed Nick that he would receive no further support. At this point, Nick told his bureau advisor that because he had no family support available locally, he had no other option than to go rough sleeping. So these are just some examples of the circumstances people are facing. We're sharing these stories not to shock and not because they're the worst, but they are shocking and they are completely unacceptable. And our advisors are faced with this every day, knowing how difficult it can be to get a resolution for people. And as I said before, the impact on people is profound. Stress, worry, deteriorating health, and even homelessness in some cases. You might have seen that the Scottish Housing Regulator has introduced new indicators on damp and mould, meaning that all social landlords from this year have to provide new information on the length of time it's taking to resolve cases of damp and mould and the scale of open and reopened cases. It is really important that bodies like the Scottish Housing Regulator are looking more closely at damp and mould. And it's also critical that people know how to report it. But in our experience, this doesn't always guarantee proper and timely response and resolution. We also know from our own evidence that it can be difficult to identify the source of damp and mould and find solutions that work for the household, but it can and has to be done. We've recently heard of new work in the social rented sector around air quality monitors, which measure moisture and humidity, and think this may help improve people's experiences. And going back a wee bit further, we also welcome the report by the Association of Local Authority Chief Housing Officers, the Chartered Institute of Housing Scotland, and other partners, which included improved information on how social landlords can respond to damp and mould. And most importantly, it moves away from this long-standing culture of blame on tenants, who for a long time have thought to have been at fault for the presence of damp and mould in their homes. So what needs to happen? Sorry, go back one slide, please. What needs to happen? I think everyone here knows that we are still absolutely very much in the midst of a housing emergency, and poor quality homes are a part of it. People must be able to live well and comfortably in their homes, and especially must not be left with no option but to become homeless, like Nick, who I mentioned earlier. Based on our evidence, we're calling for a series of recommendations to be implemented across both local and national government. Chief amongst them is the need for proper enforcement against landlords who fail to deal with damp and mould. And we know this would make the greatest material difference for tenants. Backing this up is the need for more support for landlords, which includes awareness raising and training. Next slide, please. So some of the people whose experiences we looked at as part of the Left in the Cold report were also getting into debt and arrears as they tried to pay their rent, as well as keep their homes heated and reduce damp and mould. This ties into the main theme of ForeCASt around affordability, as we know that many people who come to us for housing advice are struggling with this. So I just want to take a few moments to talk about this. Our most recent stats revealed that in Q1 of this year, we helped over 600 people with rent-related debts across both the private and social rented sectors. We also found that private renters in particular are coming to us with increasingly higher levels of average rent debt compared to the social rented sector. To put this into pounds and pence, private rented sector tenants had an average housing debt of £4,279, which is 14% higher than this time last year. And we know that many are also juggling multiple debts. When debt is this high, there's just something systemically wrong. And we know that this is partly due to the fact that Local Housing Alliance, housing benefit for people in the private rented sector, just does not match the real cost of renting. Local Housing Alliance is intended to reflect the cost of the cheapest 30% of homes in each part of the country. However, rates have been effectively frozen at 2020 levels, and the result has been to just make the private rented sector effectively unaffordable for low-income households, deepening poverty for those within it, and reducing the accessible supply of housing. In addition, research carried out by the Institute of Fiscal Studies in 2023 found that just 5% of newly listed private rental homes were priced in line with Local Housing Alliance. The research also found that these homes were generally of lower quality and more expensive to heat than average. This reflects the challenges our advisors see every day in trying to help people find affordable accommodation. And to put this in numbers, we gave out more than 1,500 pieces of advice on this area in Q1 alone. We know as well that the private rented sector is changing and it's home to more people than ever before, including more families and older people, so action must be taken. One person who came to us for advice in this area was Marcus. Marcus was previously a private tenant, but his rent was £525 per month, and his universal credit only covered £425 per month as per local housing alliance rules. This left him with a shortfall of £100 every single month. He applied for a discretionary housing payment, but this wasn't guaranteed in the long term. At the same time as trying to find work, Marcus was trying to stretch his universal credit payment to cover living expenses and car costs, among other things, which he needed for job hunting in his rural area. Marcus also suffers from depression and struggles to keep appointments, and because of this, he was sanctioned for missing appointments with his universal credit work coach, and this reduced his income even more. Marcus was eventually evicted from his private let, but was considered by his local council to have made himself intentionally homeless. He tried to appeal this with the help of Shelter Scotland, but unfortunately was unsuccessful. Marcus's best hope of finding somewhere to stay now is to try and find new private accommodation. But if he does manage to find a private let, it's unlikely that Local Housing Alliance will cover all of his rent, thus starting the cycle all over again. There are so many people in similar circumstances to Marcus who just can't bridge the shortfall between Local Housing Alliance and their actual rent. And that's why we're calling for the UK government to carry out an urgent review of Local Housing Alliance and realign it with real rents. The network sees so many people in a similar situation to Marcus who have multiple housing and debt advice needs, so there must also be recognition of this and sustainable funding for advice services who provide this holistic approach. So to bring all of this to a close and to reflect David's comments, we see such a wide variety of housing advice needs brought to the network. Damp and mould and affordability are just two of these. The negative impact on people when they have problems with their housing just cannot be emphasised enough, on people's physical and mental health, on finances, and really just the ability to live well and safely and comfortably in their homes, which is a human right. In a housing emergency, it's even more imperative that these issues, that action is taken on these issues so that more people don't become homeless. Ultimately, CAST wants to see a Scotland where everyone has a safe, secure and sustainable home. Thanks so much for your attention and looking forward to questions.
Thank you, Aoife. Undoubtedly, those stories and experiences of people that you shared were incredibly powerful and difficult to hear. People experiencing some just absolutely, totally unacceptable harm and a real challenge for us to listen to that. And I think you've really powerfully just brought our minds sharply focused that all of this conversation is about individuals and the experiences that they're facing. I am delighted to move us on to our next speakers. We've two brilliant guests joining us this morning. First, I'm going to hand over to Benjamin Napier. Benjamin is CEO of Edinburgh Cabs. That's a consortium of 4 cabs across the city. And Benjamin's going to share with us some of the experiences of his teams across Edinburgh as they navigate all things housing and advice in their local communities. So over to you, Benjamin.
Thanks very much, Emma. Big introduction there. So, yes, so the issues that have been spoken about by my colleagues there absolutely mirrored on a daily basis in cabs, not only in Edinburgh, but for my colleagues managing cabs across the country. And the statistics and the data are really only touching the surface of the reality of what's happening for people on the ground. So our advisors, where those statistics are drawn from, our advisors are required to try and record advice codes that reflect the nature of the multitude of issues that people are presenting with. And the reality is that all of those issues combined will be the sorts of things that people are presenting with. So we may only have the time to categorize it as a housing issue, but actually within that will be housing debts, difficulties in accessing benefits that would support people to pay for their housing. There'll be problems with their energy. There may be historical energy debts. There will be council tax debts. There will be repair and maintenance issues. So there'll be a multitude of things. And quite rightly, our advisors just don't have the time to be able to record every single thing that the people are presenting with. Their priority is to try and get the help and support to them. So what I'm saying is that the statistics that are being given, stark as they are, only touch the surface of actually the multitude of issues that clients are presenting with. And there is absolutely no doubt that in a country with the resources and the assets that Scotland has, we should not have people who struggle to live well and to live safely in their own homes. And certainly in a city like Edinburgh, with the resources that it have, we certainly shouldn't have people who are struggling to live well or to live safely in their own homes. But the reality is that we are struggling for people to find that. There was a statistic given earlier, the housing advice was around 14%. I think when we look at the statistics in Edinburgh around those advice codes that we've recorded as purely housing, and then those relating to housing energy, housing debt, housing benefits, is just under 30% of all of the clients that we saw in the last financial year came to us about difficulties that they were experiencing around living well and living safely within their homes. The housing emergencies have been touched on is over a year now since the housing emergency had been declared in Edinburgh. And I guess the reality, and my colleagues and the local authority and housing providers within Edinburgh would acknowledge that the position is really no better than what it was when that housing emergency was declared. We're in a position at the moment where the local authority are struggling to be able to provide people with the opportunity to apply for permanent accommodation in Edinburgh because of the backlog of people who are in unsuitable temporary accommodation that the local authority are trying to find solutions to. And that position in the recent request from the housing officers, they asked for an extension of a policy where they weren't releasing the opportunity for people to apply for permanent accommodation. They wanted to retain that until at least March 2027. I think the reality is that even that time scale, they will struggle to be able to address some of the backlog of people who are living in unsuitable temporary accommodation. And the council officers weren't able to agree to that policy simply because it seems unfathomable that that's the position that we're in. But the reality is that is the position that we're in. We in Citizens Advice Edinburgh do our best to try and work with colleagues in the local authority housing and home support team, right from the elected members to the senior officers, right down to the other council officials, housing support teams. We also work with colleagues across the registered social landlord portfolio to share practice to try and support clients as best as we can. But it's a desperate and dire situation for people who come trying to get suitable permanent accommodation in Edinburgh. It really is a really challenging situation for people, but also the ability to just heat their homes, to afford their rent, to carry out repair and maintenance. That's really challenging for people as well. It's difficult in Edinburgh for people to be able to get access to folk to carry out repair and maintenance. If that doesn't happen, the properties simply fall into disrepair. Some of the conditions that people are living in, including in local authority housing and in registered social landlord properties, is really just not good enough for people to be living like that. It's having a longer term impact on people's health and well-being. And the levels of homelessness, I think we see increasing as well in the numbers of people who are presenting to us looking for help and support because they are truly roofless, is increasing as well. And without the availability of truly affordable social housing in the city, it's very difficult for us to be able to support those people. The reality in Edinburgh is that there needs to be more housing built that is truly social housing. And that is a challenge because the local authority doesn't have the funds that it requires to be able to build that properties. It's a challenge in a city like Edinburgh to try and negotiate with house builders about making the properties available for truly social housing because there is a competitive market for private purchasing and for mid-market properties that you're competing in a very challenging environment to be able to get purely social housing built. But that's something I think we all need to rise to the challenge, to lobby Scottish Government, to lobby the local authority, to exercise all of the powers that they have to try and make sure that the building of new accommodation in Edinburgh has the required amounts and the required percentages allocated to purely social housing, and that more funding is given to make sure that it is affordable for local authorities to purchase that, and that they can compete against the private market to encourage house builders to then build those truly social housing for people. That's really the only solution that we're going to have for more proper, suitable accommodation to be built. And then while we're building that as well, to make sure that it is properly energy efficient properties for people, so they don't then have the long-term problems with the repair and maintenance and the ability to afford to reasonably heat their homes over the winter time. I'll finish by saying again, we should not be in a position in a society like Scotland or in Edinburgh where people are living in such poor circumstances as they are. We can do better. We should do better. The resources are there for a country like us to try and address these problems. And yeah, I would appeal to the funders and the policy and lawmakers to make sure that they use their powers to get that affordable housing built for people who are in need, because that's really the solution that we need to get us out of the position that we're in now. So, and I'll welcome any questions later. Thanks, Emma.
Thanks, Benjamin. Yeah, such a powerful challenge, isn't it, that we can and should do better. And I know as we're going to move through our conversation, we're going to really take some time to think about the solutions that we need to see there. I guess also just really struck by what you're saying, Benjamin, that almost 1 in 3 of the people who are coming to a cab in Edinburgh have problems with home. They're needing advice about where they're living. And I think that just really begins to show something about the scale of the issue that exists in Edinburgh City for us at the moment. I'm delighted to hand over now to our final speaker, to Alison Watson. Alison is Director of Shelter Scotland, having been with the charity since 2002. Many of you will be familiar with Alison as a real expert and a powerful voice into the issues that we're facing in Scotland around housing. So delighted to have you with us this morning. Alison, over to you.
Thank you very much for that introduction, Emma, and I really appreciate the opportunity to contribute towards today's conversation and also to hear directly about the insights on housing from across the Bureau network. That's a tremendous volume of insight, and I'll take that back to colleagues. What I thought it might be useful to do is to place what we've been hearing about the housing issues that Bureau are seeing in the wider context. And both Aoife and David in particular, and also Benjamin, have alluded to this. The wider context is that Scotland is in the grip of a deepening and devastating housing emergency. And what I want to do is just try and set out a little bit of the scale and also how we understand the harm that housing emergency has done, because I very much agree with points that have been made by previous speakers. We need to absolutely remember that behind every one of the statistics, and I am about to rattle off quite a lot of statistics, is a real person experiencing harm and hardship. In terms of the scale of the problem, Shelter Scotland commissioned research earlier on this year, which showed that 2.3 million people in Scotland are now impacted by the housing emergency. That's over 4 in 10 of the population. 42% of people in Scotland are impacted in some way. Now, that could be about the condition of their property, and we've been hearing from Aoife about that. It could be security, suitability, affordability. It could also be people who are experiencing discrimination trying to access a home, and I want to pick up that later on. I would also want to highlight that we conducted this research in 2021, and since then an additional 800,000 people are now impacted by the housing emergency. And I think that goes to some of the points you were just making, Benjamin, about how worse things are getting. In terms of understanding probably the sharpest end of the housing emergency, people experiencing homelessness, We've got the biannual stats that come out from the Scottish Government that they gather from local authorities. And every time we get those stats, we see new records being broken. And I was really struck by what you were saying, David, about sometimes I think it does take us to that place where it becomes the new normal, that we get these dreadful stats. And I think that is these stats instead should be a badge of shame and a wake-up call. The most recent stats cover the 6-month period up to the end of September. And that tells us that 33,619 households were assessed as homeless. That means that every 15 minutes in Scotland, another household becomes homeless. We know that there's 16,634 households in temporary accommodation. And just to pick up your points, Benjamin, there are now more households in temporary accommodation in Edinburgh alone than there are in the whole of Wales. And families are getting stuck in temporary accommodation for longer and longer periods of time. The average length of stay in temporary accommodation is now 292 days, put my teeth back in. For families in particular, it's much longer. And in particular at Shelter Scotland, we're concerned about families that we're working with. And this isn't rare that we're working with families who are stuck in temporary accommodation for years. And I think, Benjamin, you probably find this in Edinburgh, that is particularly a problem here in the capital. We are particularly concerned about the record numbers of kids who are stuck in temporary accommodation. 10,360 kids woke up this morning homeless in temporary accommodation. And by the time today is over, another 43 children will have joined them. The number of kids in temporary accommodation has gone up 149% since 2014. I think another way that we understand the housing emergency is looking at the formal assessments from Scotland's housing regulator. Now, the regulator published their most recent report in April. That tells us that 3 local authorities, and they're the 3 largest local authorities in Scotland, are in systemic failure. And further, 7 local authorities are at heightened risk of systemic failure. Now, systemic failure in the context of what the regulator is saying is a formal assessment by the regulator that those local authorities do not have the resources and the capacity to consistently enforce statutory housing rights. And when you look at the local authorities we're talking about, that covers half of the population of Scotland. In Glasgow alone, the council is failing to find temporary accommodation for people who are legally entitled to it at least 34 times every single day. And picking up on some of the points that you made around affordability, Aoife, we know that private rents are going up much faster than household incomes, and that local housing allowance rates are just not keeping pace. And that is a big part of the problem that we see. And just, picking up on the points you were making, Aoife, about conditions and damp and mould specifically, very much borne out in the experience of Shelter Scotland. In the first quarter of this year alone, our helpline had 197 queries about damp and mould. And also what you were sharing and what bureaus are saying about disrepair and house conditions, borne out in the 2023, the most recent Scottish House Conditions Survey. And that tells us that 34% of dwellings in the private rented sector are failing to meet the tolerable standard. And both the private rented sector and local authority dwellings have very high levels of disrepair to critical elements of the home, 59% in the case of the private rented sector and 57% in the case of local authority dwellings. Now, as I say, I've rattled off a list of dreadful, dreadful statistics, and I'm very conscious, David, of that toleration of harm. We cannot allow this to become some dystopian new normal. We have to remember that real people are suffering. In March this year, Shelter Scotland published groundbreaking research because we wanted to set out clearly the experiences that children are having in temporary accommodation. And that research was called In Your Own Words. And I've been in this game for a long time, as you said, Emma, and I was deeply shocked by what I read in that research. Kids exposed to conditions which are unsanitary and unsafe, conditions which include violence and vermin. These are damaging the health and well-being of those children, and also the researchers told us quite clearly and evidenced the lasting damage to children's development. We risk creating a lost generation of children because those kids are stuck in temporary accommodation for so long. I think it's also important to understand when we think about Scotland's housing emergency to reflect on the fact that the social inequalities that we have in Scotland are exacerbated in our housing system. Scotland's housing system isn't just broken, it is biased. Women are disproportionately impacted by the housing emergency. They experience more problems trying to access safe, secure, and affordable housing. Gender-based violence is endemic in Scotland. The most common reason for women becoming homeless is domestic abuse. And the racism in our society is reflected in the experience that minoritised ethnic communities have. They are much more likely to become homeless. And that racial inequality persists throughout the engagement of Black and people of colour's experiences in our homelessness system. 27% of those requiring temporary accommodation who do not get it are Black and people of colour, despite making up only 7% of the Scottish population. And Black and people of colour in temporary accommodation wait on average 70 days longer to get a permanent home than their Scottish white counterparts. So I just want to finish off, if I've got time, by just outlining what do we need to do to fix our broken and biased housing system. And Benjamin, the first thing very much goes to the points that you were making. It is about driving up the supply of social homes. Scottish Government has to commit to the multi-year funding that is required to drive up the supply of social homes. There are 99,000 households in Scotland on waiting lists for social homes, as well as the record levels of homelessness that we've been hearing about. Housing rights. We're consistently pushing Scottish Government to provide more funding for local authorities like Edinburgh so that they can consistently uphold people's housing rights. We have to move local authorities out of a situation where they're facing systemic failure in their homelessness services. And lastly, just picking up the points I was making about inequalities, the Scottish Government has to commit to the policies that tackle the inequalities in our housing system, that bake in gender inequality, that bake in racism to a response to homelessness. So those are some of the key things that we're calling for, but I'd be really interested to pick up the conversation about what other people think and look forward to that.
Thank you, Alison. Such rich insight, and I think those statistics just really complemented really well what we've heard about the individual experience, so that we can both hold the space for this is happening in terrible ways at an individual level, but it's also happening at scale. And I think we need to be able to grapple with both of those things. Thanks, folks, for the questions that have been coming in. We've got some great questions there we're going to get started with, but please do keep your questions coming in terms of any of the things that you've heard from any of our speakers this morning. I'm going to get us started. There've been a couple of questions that have come in around damp and mould, so I'm going to group them together. And I'm going to come to you first, Aoife, so just giving you a little quick heads up on that one. We've had a question there that sort of asked us about are there particular groups of people that we know that are sort of experiencing some harm from damp and mould, and some other reflections there on the fact that we know that damp and mould has been a long-standing issue. Why do you think we've not seen the action that's been needed to tackle it? So yeah, who's experiencing the most harm, and what do you think is holding us back from the action that we need to see? So start with you, Aoife, and then probably come to yourself, Alison, after.
Thanks, Emma. Yeah, they're really good questions, and I think questions that were asked a lot of the time. Who's been affected? Where can we target help, for example? But from our evidence, it seems to be happening across the piece. It's all different family types that are coming to us, or all different demographics, families with children, older people, single people. Damp and mold doesn't discriminate, I suppose, but it's just about accessing the redress. And I think that links to what Alison has said, that there are more challenges facing certain groups when they try to do that. So that's really important to bear in mind. As to why no action has been taken. Action has been taken in sort of piecemeal ways, but we need a really brave, robust response to damp and mold. It feels like there's been sort of action around the edges, I suppose, but real action needs to be taken. Real funding needs to go into looking at solutions for damp and mold and rolling them out across the rented sectors and owner-occupier sectors. So that's a big piece of it. Lots of different types of guidance has come out, but it's all just little pieces, and somebody needs to weave it together, I suppose, and make this national and set the expectations very clear about there should not be damp and mould in Scotland's homes, and people should be living in homes free from this.
Alison, maybe hear from yourself.
I mean, I'd really echo a number of things that Aoife's talked about there. I think when we understand damp and mould in the social housing sector. I think what we're seeing is the results of decades of underinvestment in the social housing sector. Landlords do not have the resources to keep up. And I say that as a reason, not as an excuse. I think when we look at the private rented sector, I very much agree with what Aoife's saying. I think people have rights, but they either don't know what their rights are or they're really scared to try and implement them. I think the scarcity of supply in the private rented sector is such that people think it's a crappy home, but I better hang on to it because I'm not sure if there's anything better out there. And that's the situation that we've arrived at. And I think people do have rights of redress in terms of house conditions, but rights need to be resourced. And I very much agree with what Aoife's saying. I just don't think we've arrived at that position. People need advocacy, they need support. And we need to understand that when the decision has been made, action will actually flow, and all of that needs to be properly resourced.
Thanks, both. I'm going to take us over to a different topic. We always try and get through as many as we can. And we've got some really interesting reflections there, I think, from Joanna, hopefully I'm pronouncing your name correctly, about the sort of rise in demand for advice, particularly from single-aged working people, in particular sort of single-aged men. I'm just wondering if that's a common issue that we're seeing. So I think maybe go to David and then yourself, Benjamin, perhaps just for some reflections on what that's looking like.
Yeah, thanks, Emma. I'll let Benjamin share his own experience of what that feels like on the ground. We know at national level, we look at our data, around 36%. Think of people we support are single adults, working age households. And in a way, that's not surprising, but it's something we're tolerating, isn't it? When you think about some of the different parts of the social security safety net or different things that are available to people, so often that's predicated on existing support, existing gateways to support that single working age people aren't always getting. So we're always keen to focus in on the things that really set us apart. You know, it's a challenge we set ourselves. What are we seeing that no one else is seeing? So looking ahead to May 2026, and we haven't mentioned that yet, but the time is ripe to be thinking about solutions, to get these into manifestos, to get these into party programmes. We're going to have a real clear focus on that particular demographic, and not just the sort of problems and issues they're experiencing, but the solutions that we want to see to make a difference and to stop the toleration of harm.
Come straight in, Benjamin.
Yeah, the numbers of single people who present for advice with us are slightly higher than the national average. Maybe not surprising in the city that you would see that, given the demographics. But yeah, breakdown in relationships then do result in more single people, but actually that has a wider impact on the availability of housing then. You've got people who used to live together, now both looking for separate accommodation. You've got two different parties who have less money then to be able to heat, maintain, afford the running costs of a property. So that is an impact as well. So yeah, that relationship breakdown has a knock-on effect on both the availability and people's ability to afford the cost of that. So that is, yeah, it does have a problem. We'll certainly see that increase. Just to comment as well on a little bit about the repair and maintenance things, if I can. I know you want to stick to specific topics, but a lot of that is about there just isn't enough people to carry out repair and maintenance work. You know, the impact of Brexit, we lost a lot of the workforce there. We need to be doing more to try and support people who are out of work in the country at the moment to try and get into that kind of skilled job so that we have a labour force to be able to carry out the repair and maintenance. And then the sale of social housing years ago is now having an impact because people who bought properties, some of which are still owned by the local authority, need significant repair and maintenance. And the people who bought them at a low cost don't have the money to be able to carry out that repair and maintenance. And they're being asked to contribute to a shared repair and maintenance bill with the council that are like paying out significantly more than you would do if you were managing to negotiate that on a private basis. And people can't afford to do it. And that's having a significant impact on people being able to maintain properties that they were fortunate enough to have ownership of, but they also just can't afford the repair and maintenance as a knock-on effect of everybody else living in that block.
Thanks both for that. I'm going to move us on. We've had a question come in about housing and home issues in rural communities, and I think it'd be great for us maybe just to touch on that. Lots of our conversation today has been about what's happening in some of the cities, and yeah, I just want to maybe quickly whiz around the panel about any reflections that we're sort of seeing in rural communities. So we'll go Aoife, Alison, and then David, just to hear some quick reflections on issues to do with housing, and I guess issues more generally that those in rural communities are facing. So start with yourself, Aoife.
Thanks, Emma. Yeah, I mean, there's no doubt that rural communities are facing significant challenges that have some similarities, but some important differences to their sort of city counterparts. We know that Argyll and Bute was one of the first councils to declare a housing emergency for very specific reasons, some of which mirrored city counterparts, but some of which were uniquely rural, and a lot of that was around, turning voids around because there wasn't the tradespeople in rural areas, for example. We know that people living in rural areas face particular challenges. As I say, we know that they have higher energy debts, for example, compared to sort of urban locations. And that transport is a real issue too. So there's a lot of sort of side issues going on that can contribute to a person's circumstances. And I think it's really worth considering these and policymakers bearing these in mind as they think about how to tackle the housing emergency.
Go for it, Alison.
I mean, I would echo a lot of what Aoife said, and absolutely the very first local authority to declare a housing emergency was Argyll and Bute. And I think some of the issues that we see in Argyll and Bute are echoed in other local authority areas which are highly rural. And I think that's the impact of second homes and short-term lets, an additional squeeze in terms of people trying to get access to affordable accommodation in areas. I mean, Skye is a real case in point. One of the most acute shortages of affordable housing is on Skye. And I think there's also, just to add to what Aoife said, I don't want to repeat anything that Aoife said, but I think there's also, we see very significant issues around hidden homelessness in rural areas. People who don't recognise they're homeless, they don't recognise that sofa surfing or living in overcrowded situations, etc., not recognising that is homelessness. And sometimes that's compounded because there's deep local knowledge of the availability of social homes. So you'll get these big spikes in some rural areas when the social home becomes available and everyone kind of piles in, tries to get it, and then kind of disappears again. So I think it's about understanding that Scotland is a highly rural nation, and we need to have, I think, more visibility and action specifically on the rural challenges.
And finally, yourself, David.
Yeah, just quickly for me, as Eva pointed out, energy debt is much higher in rural areas. As we were saying yesterday in response to the price cap, average debt we see across the network is £2,500, so over £3,100. But it's not the only premium that rural communities are paying. And that's why it's so critical that we're looking at the whole picture: housing, debt, energy, the whole picture that our networks see, and that we can share that insight.
We are vastly running out of time, and there are many great questions still in the chat. I think realistically we're not going to get to them all, unfortunately, today. There was a question coming up, and we've touched on it a little bit, about the forthcoming elections, Holyrood elections next year, and what are the solutions that we really need to see policymakers deliver if we're really going to tackle the issues that we've been discussing this morning and stop the harm. So I'd love to again sort of come around the room. I'll start with yourself, Benjamin, and just hear from the panel about what's the one big solution that you want us to be pressing forward, I guess, collectively, and to see our policymakers deliver on. So I'll start with yourself, Benjamin.
Yeah, proper funding for local authorities to be able to afford the building of proper social housing, and to exercise their powers through legislation and planning consent to make sure that that happens, and that promises that are being made to build that aren't then taken back. But put the money into the house building straight away. Don't faff about with it. Doing innovative ways of looking at what to do with it. Get the money out first of all that's needed to build the housing, and get more of it out and use your powers to make sure that it actually follows through and people building social housing.
Absolutely, that urgency, I think, is completely critical. Aoife, yourself?
I think there are many, many solutions that are needed. But similarly to Benjamin, it's about the delivery of truly affordable homes and a much boosted, much more ambitious plan for delivering really high quality social homes in particular. I think that's the thing I'd say.
Alison.
Social homes every time. And I think it is about saying it needs to be a multi-year commitment, because the Scottish Government made savage cuts to the Affordable Housing Supply Programme budget. Okay, they've reinstated that. But the lead-in time for development requires developers, social and private, to have the confidence that the money will continue to be there. So it has to be that long-term, multi-year commitment. And I think, just picking up on some of the points you were making, Benjamin, I do think in the immediate term, we need to drive up acquisition. Acquisition works, enabling local authorities to buy homes from the open market and turn them into social homes. And we're particularly pushing for more acquisition of larger properties as a key way to start clearing the backlogs that Benjamin was talking about, but specifically getting families out of temporary accommodation.
And finally, David.
Yeah, I'll stay on investment but develop that slightly. Ours is advice that changes lives, but is exposed to a level of precarity and uncertainty that few other essential services are, So around supporting the people who support the people, and it's that bit around, don't tell me what you value, show me your budget, and preferably show me your multi-year budgets, and we'll tell you what you value.
Thank you, everybody. And I know these are just a glimpse at some of the actions and solutions that we need to see here. I just really want to thank our panelists for your wisdom, for your insight, for everything that you've shared with us this morning. It's been a really powerful conversation. My colleague Nicole has just dropped an evaluation form into the chat. We love to get your feedback so that we can continue to improve these webinars and be focusing on the things that you want us to. But thank you so much for your time. Thank you for being with us. Thank you for your questions. And we look forward to seeing you on our next episode of ForeCASt that's going to be in November. You'll get a post-ForeCASt email from us later on this morning as well. One of the things that's going to be in that is a new product from us called Home Truths, our quarterly housing brief. We've just but touched on the things that we have to share with you. So watch out for that email, and thanks everyone for your time this morning. Take care.